My name is Debbie, and I'm calling Chicago home. Not long ago, I found this channel, hit that subscribe button, and noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. You welcome stories from your viewers. Now, I want to be upfront with you. I don't have a personal horror story to share, and honestly, I thank God for that every single day. But what I do have is something I believe is every bit as powerful, every bit as worth telling. I have the story of my grandmother, my late grandmother, Zelda. And if you'll give me just a little of your time tonight, I promise you, her story will stay with you long after you've finished listening. Grandma Zelda didn't talk about what she lived through very often. You have to understand, the people who carry the heaviest memories are usually the ones least inclined to speak about them. The weight of what she witnessed, what she survived, what she lost, it sat quietly inside her for most of her life. But every so often, in those rare and sacred moments, she would open a small window into her past and let a little light fall through. And when she did, she chose her words carefully, as though each one cost her something. I remember those moments as a child, sitting perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid that if I made so much as a sound, she'd close that window again. I remember her story almost word for word. And with my mother's help to fill in a few of the gaps she left behind, I want to share it with all of you tonight. Because some stories are too important to be kept within the walls of a single family. Some stories belong to the world. Grandma Zelda was born in 1931, in a small village called Sopotskin, a place that sat in what was then Poland, but is now part of Belarus. It was a modest, tight-knit community of roughly 1,300 souls, nearly 250 families living side by side. And Sopotskin was what was known as a shtetl, which meant that the vast majority of those families were Jewish. It was a world unto itself, a world of shared language, shared faith, shared struggle, and above all, shared love. She used to wake up to the sound of cows being led out to pasture each morning. Most families kept a milk cow in their barn, and there was something grounding and rhythmic about that sound, hooves on cobblestone, the low and gentle lowing of animals starting their day alongside their owners. Zelda's family had a cow of their own, and they'd named her Nuri, after the Yiddish word for buttercup. They fed her straw and potatoes grown in their root cellar, and Zelda always spoke of Nuri with a warmth that surprised people, as though that animal represented something gentle and irreplaceable about those early years. Her father was a tailor. He stitched coats and trousers in a small workshop, his hands always moving, always precise. While most of the men around him did hard physical labor or traded in grain and cattle, he worked with thread and needle and the particular kind of patience that fine craftsmanship demands. He did all right by the family, not comfortably, not easily, but all right. Money was always a little tight, as Grandma Zelda would say. The Polish government imposed heavy taxes on the Jewish community and legally barred them from owning land, which meant that instead of building equity in their homes, they handed over rent month after month, year after year, with nothing to show for it but the privilege of staying. And yet, and this is the part that always moved me most when she told it, even within those constraints, even under the weight of those injustices, the people of Sopotskin found ways to take care of one another. The rabbi's wife organized something called Matan Basti, a quiet, dignified form of charity in which food and goods were donated anonymously to families in need, so that no one had to feel the sting of public shame along with their hardship. And there was a volunteer group called the Linos Hack, something like a community Red Cross, whose members would go directly to the homes of the sick and tend to them so their families wouldn't lose a day's work caring for them. That kind of community, the kind that wraps itself around its most vulnerable members without being asked, it's rare. It's something worth remembering. If you're new here and this kind of storytelling speaks to you, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and joining our community. Stories like this one, stories of real people, real survival, and real resilience, are what we're all about. And you truly won't want to miss what comes next. Zelda said that life was hard, yes. It was always hard. But the holidays, oh, the holidays were something else entirely. During Passover, families would come together around communal ovens and bake matzahs side by side, kneading and shaping and laughing until their arms ached and their faces were flushed and the whole village smelled of warm bread. During other celebrations, great bonfires lit up the fields outside of town, and people gathered together to sing old songs and share stories that stretched late into the night. Those moments, she said, were golden. They were the thread that held everything together. But every thread, eventually, gets pulled. On September 1st, 1939, when my grandmother Zelda was still just 8 years old, Germany invaded Poland. The news traveled fast, even to a quiet village in the far east of the country. And although Zapotskin sat far from the front lines, its people knew, with the particular, bone-deep knowing of a community that had endured centuries of persecution, exactly what German hands meant for Jewish lives. Warsaw was under siege. The Polish military was folding. And the future, once something you could at least imagine, suddenly became unimaginable. And then, on September the 17th, something unexpected happened. The Soviet Red Army crossed into Poland from the east. It turned out that the Russians and the Germans had made a secret agreement, a quiet, cynical arrangement to carve up the country between them like a loaf of bread. But because that agreement kept Zapotskin out of German reach, Zelda said that many people welcomed the Soviet soldiers as though they were liberators. Anybody, she said, seemed better than the Germans. And at first, the Soviets treated them reasonably enough. But over the next year and a half or so, the mask began to slip. The Russians started evicting certain families from their homes without clear reason or warning. They shut down the village stores and forced craftsmen, including Zelda's father, with his tailor's hands, into compulsory labor collectives. The beautiful old wooden synagogue, which had stood for generations as the beating heart of the community, was stripped of its sacred purpose and turned into a movie house. And then the secret police arrived, going from door to door, questioning people, arresting some in the night and leaving their families to wonder what happened to them. It was a different kind of hard, quieter than what came before, but no less suffocating. And yet, none of it, not the taxes, not the occupiers, not the evictions or the fear, could have prepared them for what arrived in the summer of 1941. Because that summer, Germany broke its secret peace agreement with the Soviet Union and launched a full-scale surprise invasion aimed directly at the Russian heartland. And Zapotskin, my grandmother's little village of cows and buttercup and communal bread, sat almost exactly on the new German-Soviet border. When the attack came, they were among the very first to feel it. The Russian soldiers stationed in the area had been dismissive of the possibility, telling the villagers that Germany would never dare strike the mighty Soviet Union, not while Britain was still fighting back with everything it had. The people of Zapotskin held on to those words like a lifeline. But then, at 2 o'clock in the morning on June the 22nd, the Germans fired their artillery. The shells fell without warning, setting houses ablaze, igniting barns, reducing the old synagogue to smoking rubble. Dozens of people were killed before dawn even broke. And when the artillery finally fell silent, the villagers who had survived the night came out from wherever they had been hiding to try to put out the fires and recover the bodies of their loved ones. That was when the German soldiers moved in. They forced every survivor, women and children included, to dig a massive mass grave in the fields just beyond the village. Their hands blistered and bled before the soldiers finally ordered them to stop. And when they asked for water, for bread, for anything at all, the Germans refused them. Instead, they were ordered to carry their dead from the ruins of the village and bring them to the pit. Grandma Zelda said she saw a neighbor carrying the remains of his wife toward that grave. She was in pieces. And so was he. And the young German soldier standing beside him showed not a single flicker of compassion. He just kept shouting, "Schnell! Schnell! Hurry up, over and over again." But the man couldn't hear him. Or perhaps he simply could not care. He just kept walking, step by step, carrying what was left of the woman he had loved, whispering prayers for the dead under his breath. That image never left my grandmother. Not for a single day of the rest of her life. They might have survived, some of them, at least, had the Germans not discovered what the soldiers made careful note of once they'd rounded everyone up. More than 2/3 of Zapotskin's population was Jewish. And the moment that discovery was made, everything changed. The German commander assembled the villagers and spoke 3 words that would seal a fate. Poles to the right. Jews to the left. People only understood what was happening when the Jewish residents began to be marched back toward the mass grave they themselves had just dug. And then the column broke. Voices cried out, "Run, run for your lives." People scattered. Some who rushed the soldiers were shot where they stood. A few brave men threw themselves at the captors in a desperate attempt to overwhelm them, knowing they would likely die, buying a few precious seconds for someone else to escape. There were too many guns. Too many soldiers. And yet, in the chaos that their sacrifice created, a small handful of villagers managed to slip away into the trees. One of them was my grandmother Zelda. She ran. She ran with everything she had, her small legs carrying her deeper and deeper into the woods with every step, branches whipping at her face, the sound of gunshots fading slowly behind her. Her mother had told her to run, and in the innocence and terror of that moment, little 8-year-old Zelda believed that her mother would be right behind her. But when she finally stopped, lungs burning, legs shaking, she turned around and found only trees. She called out. She listened. Nothing came back but the silence of the forest. And then the understanding began to settle in, that quiet, devastating understanding that children are not supposed to have to carry. She was alone. She had no idea where she was. And she could never go home. Has something stayed with you from a story you've heard, something that never quite let you go? If that's happened to you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. We're a community here, and your thoughts and experiences truly matter to all of us. And so she walked. She walked for hours, stopping only to drink from a canal before wading across one of its narrower stretches. In winter, that crossing would have killed her. But the warm summer evening kept the cold from setting in, and by nightfall her clothes were nearly dry. She kept moving as long as she could, but eventually the darkness became absolute, so thick and so complete that she could barely make out the ground in front of her feet. She was about to curl up on the forest floor, simply stop where she was and let sleep take her, when she noticed something through the trees. A faint, orange glow. A campfire. She crept toward it slowly, quietly, pushing through the undergrowth until a makeshift shelter came into view, a low structure built from mud and leaves and fallen wood. Over the fire, a large cauldron bubbled and steamed. And hanging from the branches all around it were the bodies of skinned and headless animals. Grandma Zelda was certain, in that moment, that she had stumbled onto the home of a witch. And when a hunched old woman shuffled out from beneath the blanket that served as the shelter's door, patchy gray hair, a hooked nose, small and sharp eyes that found Zelda immediately, her fear became absolute. She saw the woman's lips pull back into a crooked smile, revealing teeth that were blackened and decaying. And then she ran. The old woman called after her. She tried at first to sound warm, maternal even. "Little girl, come back here at once." But when Zelda didn't stop, the woman's voice changed. It sharpened. "I'll find you," she shrieked into the dark. "Just you wait and see." Of course, looking back with the wisdom of the years that followed, my grandmother understood exactly who that woman almost certainly was. She was no witch. She was most likely a local villager, someone who had been forced out of her home by the Soviet occupiers and had chosen life in the forest over deportation to a labor camp in the far east of the country. She probably wanted nothing more than to help a frightened little girl. But Zelda was 8 years old, traumatized, exhausted, and utterly alone. And so she ran from the one person in that forest who might have sheltered her. She fell. She got up. She fell again. She grazed her knees and tore her elbows open and struck her head against the root of a tree hard enough to draw blood from her hairline. She only stopped when she was absolutely certain no one was following her anymore. And then she found the hollow of a tree stump, curled herself inside it, and fell asleep. Nightmares pulled her awake before dawn, and she woke up screaming. Frightened that someone might have heard her, she was on her feet and moving again before the sky had fully lightened. She walked for hours more, her stomach growling persistently, her eyes moving over the mushrooms and fungi that dotted the ground around her, and passing every one of them by. She knew better than to eat anything she couldn't identify. But the longer she went without food or water, the more her body began to quietly fail her. She could feel it happening. One step at a time, she was running out of strength. And then she found a wide dirt path cutting through the trees. Her heart lifted. A path like this had to lead somewhere, and somewhere meant people, and people meant safety. She followed it with a new kind of determination, a fragile but real hope warming her chest from the inside out. That hope disappeared the moment she heard the sound of an engine. She assumed it was a Russian military truck. Green canvas and red army boots and soldiers headed to the front, that's what she expected to see when it rounded the bend. Instead, the truck that came into view was a shade of gray that was unmistakably, sickeningly German. She had only seconds. She could run and risk being shot. Or she could hide. She hid. By some miracle of desperation and luck, she found a hollowed-out log large enough to crawl inside. The interior was wet and foul-smelling, slick with slime, alive with insects that crawled across her skin and nestled into her hair. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. The truck stopped. The engine cut out. A sharp voice barked a command in German. She heard soldiers climb down from the back. Their boots crunched on the ground, getting louder, closer, closer still. One of them, she said, was no more than 15 feet away from where she lay. And then, a girl's voice cut through the air. High and furious and entirely unafraid. She was speaking in Belarusian, not Yiddish, not Polish. And she was screaming at the soldiers. Haven't you taken enough? Leave her alone. You Germans are animals. Nothing but animals. There were other women in that truck. Grandma could hear them, their voices, their fear. One of them begged the shouting girl to be quiet, to stop drawing attention, to please not make things worse. But the girl didn't stop. And when the Germans stopped laughing and started shouting, something happened, a scuffle, a cry of pain, and then chaos. The search for Zelda was abandoned as the soldiers rushed to control the situation at the truck. There was screaming and shouting, the sound of boots running, and then, a single gunshot. Loud enough to make Zelda flinch inside that log. Silence fell over the soldiers. But the women in the truck became hysterical. A German voice, older, harder, began berating a younger-sounding soldier, presumably for firing. And then the order was given. Back into the truck. And the truck drove on. Zelda waited a long time before she crawled out. She made her way back to the track through the trees. And lying in the dirt at the edge of the path was the body of a young woman. She was on her back, eyes wide open, staring up at the empty sky. Zelda stood there for a moment, looking at her. Then she turned and walked on. She avoided the path after that. She slipped back into the trees and kept moving, hoping to reach the nearby villages of Kadesh or Kitty. But the forest outside Sapotskin is vast, immense and nearly featureless in its sameness. Tall trees, fallen logs, dappled light and silence in every direction. Her vision began to swim. Her legs felt like they were filling with sand. She was becoming lightheaded from hunger and thirst, and she started to fear that she would simply fall down somewhere in those trees and never get up again. And then she heard something she didn't expect to hear. Music. A violin. Mournful and beautiful, threading through the trees like a voice searching for someone to listen to it. She followed the sound until she found a small Russian encampment, and sitting on an ammunition tin near its edge was a wounded soldier, eyes closed, playing a slow and sorrowful old Russian song as though he were playing it for God himself. Zelda stopped behind a tree and watched him. When he finished the song, he opened his eyes, looked around, and saw her. He didn't startle. He simply looked at her and, without making a sudden move, gently motioned for her to come and sit down. Grandma Zelda didn't speak Russian. She knew Yiddish and a little Polish. But she understood kindness. The man gave her water and bread, and she ate with the kind of desperation that only true hunger produces. And as she ate, she noticed the bloody bandages wrapped around the soldier's abdomen. She noticed how pale he was, how sunken his cheeks. He talked to her as she ate, his words washing over her in a language she barely understood. But the meaning underneath them was clear enough. He was dying. And in the final hours he had left, all he wanted was to play his violin. When she finished eating, he pointed off through the trees and spoke a few words she could understand: soldiers, bread, water. He was directing her. He was helping her find her way. She thanked him. He smiled. And as she walked away from him, he lifted the violin to his shoulder and began playing that same sorrowful, beautiful song. She listened to it growing fainter and fainter behind her. And then she couldn't hear it anymore. Please take a moment to like this video if these stories move you. And share it with someone you care about, someone who appreciates stories of real courage and real humanity. You never know whose day it might change. Zelda's feet and legs were aching deeply by this point, the kind of ache that goes past muscle and settles into bone. But having eaten, having drunk, knowing that safety was somewhere on the other side of those trees, she found the will to keep going. She pushed through the woods, whispering prayers, watching the light shift through the canopy, refusing to stop. And then something whistled past her ear with a sharp and unmistakable sound, and a fraction of a second later, the crack of a rifle shot rolled through the trees. She dove behind the nearest tree. A second bullet struck it hard enough to shake the trunk. And then Zelda did something she hadn't allowed herself to do through any of it, not through the grave, not through the night alone in the forest, not through the German truck or the dead woman in the road. She screamed. She let everything out, all the grief, all the terror, all the exhaustion, all the loneliness, in a long, raw, wordless wail. And the tree shook beside her as more bullets hit it. Then the firing stopped. She braced herself. She waited to be surrounded, to be seized, to face whatever was coming. And then she heard a voice shouting in Polish, "It's a girl. It's just a little girl." The voice was chastising someone. And then that same voice, softer now, called out to her, telling her to come out, that they meant no harm, that they wanted to help her. She thought it was a trick. She peered around the trunk of the tree, heart hammering, and saw a group of men and women moving toward her through the forest. Not German uniforms. Civilian clothes. Polish and Belarusian partisans. Fighters who had chosen the woods over surrender. By nightfall, Grandma Zelda was sitting in a mixed encampment of partisans and Soviet soldiers, exhausted beyond words but alive. She was given food and water again, and then she accompanied various groups of retreating Russian soldiers as they pulled back toward Moscow, where they intended to make their last stand in defense of their capital. In Moscow, she was placed in a home for orphan children. And there, she listened as news of the war trickled in. When she first arrived, the mood was grim. Everyone seemed to believe it was only a matter of time before the Germans reached the city. But slowly, the tide began to turn. The German forces failed to complete the encircling movement they had planned around Moscow. Then the Russian counterattacks began, each one more decisive than the last. The first real celebration came when it was confirmed that German forces had been pushed entirely off Soviet soil. The second came when Soviet boots first stepped onto German territory, when the war those men had started found its way home to them. And then came the greatest news of the 20th century. The leader of Germany, the man whose name I don't need to say here, because you know it, was dead. At first, people could barely believe it. In those days it was genuinely difficult to separate real news from propaganda, and something this momentous required confirmation before anyone allowed themselves to feel it. But when the news was confirmed, when it became undeniable, the joy that swept through that orphanage, through Moscow, through every corner of the world where people had suffered under that shadow, was unlike anything that had ever been felt before. And then Germany surrendered. The war was over. After the peace, the Soviets kept much of the territory they had taken, including the eastern portion of Berlin. And then in 1949, at just 18 years of age, my grandmother Zelda was sent from Moscow to Poland as part of a work program, assigned to help document the reconstruction of Warsaw. It was there that she met a man, an American journalist of Polish origin. They could speak to each other in Polish, and as they worked side by side, cataloging the slow and painful resurrection of a city from its ruins, they fell in love. They married. And when his assignment ended, Zelda went with him to America. She later learned that the Soviet government had declared her a traitor, technically, for leaving before her work assignment was completed. But Grandma Zelda didn't give that a second thought. She had no intention of ever returning to Europe, not when the wall fell, not when the Soviet Union finally crumbled under the weight of its own rigid and bloated machinery. The memories were simply too powerful, she said. To travel back through that continent would be to walk through an enormous cemetery, one where she didn't know where her family was buried or whether they were buried at all. She knew where the mass grave was. That, she could never forget. But she also knew that as the Germans began losing the war, they had sent men back to dig up those graves, to burn the remains in great pyres. To erase the evidence of what they had done. There was no guarantee that even that ground still held what she had carried away from it in her heart. And so her heart became the cemetery. A living, breathing, beating memorial to the people she had loved and lost. She carried them with her every day, in every room she walked into, in every meal she sat down to, in every moment of ordinary life that they never got to have. And she passed their memory on, first to her daughter, and then to me. So here's to you, Grandma Zelda. You survived the unsurvivable. You walked through fire, literally, through fire, and came out the other side. You may have a grave here in America, but just as you always did, I'll carry every memory of you in my heart, where no one can ever dig them up, burn them, or erase them. What do you think when you hear a story like this one? Does it change the way you look at your own life, your own struggles? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a single story we share together. Many years ago now, at a Thanksgiving gathering that I remember fondly, my cousin and I were deep in a conversation about old Kevin Costner movies. This specific one called The Postman. Now for those of you who haven't seen it, the premise isn't complicated. Society collapses, lawlessness takes over, and Kevin Costner saves what's left of civilization by, of all things, restarting the United States Postal Service. My cousin and I were watching clips and getting a little wound up about how unrealistic it all seemed, going back and forth about movies and authenticity and how Hollywood always takes the easy road. What we didn't know, and this is the part that makes the whole thing, was that our great-uncle Joe had woken up from his nap in the next room and had been quietly listening to every single word we said. Now, I think I made some comment about movies never being believable enough, never capturing how truly strange real life can actually be. And that's when the old man piped up from his chair and said, without any preamble at all, there are much stranger stories than that have never been put to film. I'll tell you that for nothing. My cousin and I looked at each other. Like what, Uncle Joe? We asked. And he leaned forward in his chair with that particular look in his eyes, the one that meant he was about to hold court, and he said, like what about a story about a town called Story and the Wolf Man living out near Murder Creek? Now, my cousin and I did what any reasonable young person would do when an elderly relative said something like that. We waved him off. We told him there was no such story, no town called Story, and certainly no place in this world called Murder Creek. But Uncle Joe didn't blink. He swore up and down that every word of it was true. He said he had met the Wolf Man himself, that the man was covered head to toe in thick dark hair and had yellow eyes and was as real as either of us sitting in that living room. Swear on the Bible, Uncle Joe, my cousin said. I'll swear on whatever you'd like, he replied, completely composed. And then, in exchange for someone bringing him a cold beer from the fridge, a transaction my cousin completed without hesitation, Uncle Joe settled back and told us this story. Our great-uncle Joe was born in 1921 in a small Arkansas town called Mount Ida, the largest town in Montgomery County at the time, though largest is a relative term when you're talking about a community of only a few hundred people. The rest of the county's population was scattered across little hamlets with names like Malden, Gibbs, Washita, and Story. Back in those days, Story was barely more than a cluster of houses and a site that had been marked out for a Baptist church, just a little clearing at the western edge of the Washita National Forest, almost entirely surrounded by dense, dark, whispering pine woods. Uncle Joe went to high school with a girl who lived up in Story. Her name was Emily Bandy. She was a pretty young woman, light blonde hair, big blue eyes, and according to Uncle Joe, every single boy at school had a crush on her at some point or another. And then one day in 1935, 14-year-old Emily walked into the woods to find a toy arrow her little brother had lost. He'd been crying about it for the better part of an hour, and rather than keep listening to him carry on, Emily had gone out to look for it herself. She did not come back out. She was found a few hours later by her father and her uncle, who had grown frantic and gone searching for her. And what they found when they located her stopped both men cold with horror. Emily Bandy had been beaten savagely and stripped of her clothes. She was alive when they reached her, barely, clinging to consciousness with everything she had. A doctor was called and arrived as fast as the roads would allow. He worked quickly and competently, stopping the internal bleeding and administering what was then considered a cutting-edge medical procedure, a blood transfusion. When he finally straightened up and turned to face Emily's father, he said the girl might just survive. And she did. Emily Bandy survived. But it wasn't until she had recovered enough strength to speak that she described her attacker, and when she did, the color drained from the faces of everyone in that room. Because according to Emily, what had attacked her was not a man. She said she'd been walking through the pines, eyes down, focused on the ground, searching carefully for her brother's arrow. And then something had lunged from behind a tree and struck her so hard across the side of the head that she lost consciousness before she even hit the ground. When she came to, she was on the forest floor, and something was on top of her, something enormous and dark and covered in thick black hair all over its body. It drooled as it made sounds deep in its throat. And when she tried to resist, it began hitting her again. She remembered it howling. She remembered it rearing up and rolling away, and she thought the ordeal was over, and then it lunged back and beat her until the world went dark again. She said when her father and uncle first woke her, she believed she was in heaven. And when she understood that she was not, the pain was so overwhelming that, for a moment, all she wanted was to go back. The county sheriff was among those who heard Emily's account. He organized a search of the woods around Story right away, not just deputies, but a large crowd of armed volunteers carrying shotguns and rifles, which created its own particular set of challenges. Keeping that many nervous, trigger-happy men from accidentally shooting one another took nearly as much effort as searching for the creature itself. The first search found nothing. The second search, mounted the following day, also came back empty-handed. But on the morning of the third day, a deputy named Adams got up before the sun, put on his uniform, pulled on a blaze orange hunting cap, and walked quietly into the woods alone with a rifle across his shoulder. Uncle Joe told us that Deputy Adams was half Choctaw on his father's side and had grown up learning hunting and tracking the right way, through years of patient, attentive practice in the field. The county sheriff had been reluctant to let him go out on his own, worried about the liability of a lone deputy in those woods. But Deputy Adams had reached the end of his patience with the crowds and the noise, and so on that third morning, he slipped away and went to find the monster himself. He started at the precise spot where the attack on Emily Bandy had taken place. And from there, he moved deeper and deeper into the woods, reading the forest as his father had taught him to, following faint signs that most men would have walked right past. He eventually reached a stream out near a place called Colibri Mountain. The sun had just broken over the horizon, and the light filtering through the trees was that soft, particular blue-gray of early morning. Deputy Adams was walking along the water's edge when he stopped dead. Downstream, maybe 50 to 60 yards away, something was kneeling at the water and drinking from the stream with its hands cupped together. And whatever it was not a man, or at least, not like any man Adams had ever seen. It wore what appeared to be rags. But its exposed arms, its shoulders, its legs, all of it was covered in the same thick, dark hair that Emily Bandy had described. Adams stood absolutely still, watching this creature drink, unaware of his presence. Then, slowly, he raised his rifle to his shoulder, and in doing so, made the small, distinct sound of a round being chambered. The creature looked up, saw him, and bolted into the trees on two legs at a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size. Adams said afterward that he had been too stunned to even attempt a shot. And besides, whatever that thing was, it needed to come in alive. Even as far back as the 1930s, there were stories and theories about Sasquatch, about wild men of the woods. Deputy Adams was a practical man who prided himself on having encountered just about everything the natural world had to offer. And yet, standing there on the bank of that stream, he could not account for what he had just seen. He went straight back to the sheriff and reported what he'd found. A new search was immediately organized, this time smaller, more deliberate. Instead of fanning out through the woods, deputies and a select handful of experienced hunters established concealed positions near water sources and waited. Watched. But their target didn't show itself. Which only confirmed, as Adams put it to the sheriff, that they were dealing with something highly intelligent. And a highly intelligent predator was a particularly dangerous one. After the stakeout failed, Adams stayed in the woods alone. He zigzagged through the trees for miles, looking for any trace of the creature, following every sign and instinct he had. He spent a night huddled by a campfire somewhere near Colibri Mountain, knowing the thing was out there in the dark, and he told people later that it was the most frightened he had ever been in his life. But he made it through the night. And at first light, he kept going. He was getting within a mile or two of Murder Creek, which, yes, is a real place, and we did look it up, and my cousin nearly fell off the couch when we found it, when he started noticing things scattered through the undergrowth. Animal carcasses. All of them stripped bare of meat. And twisted into some of the skeletal remains were tufts of thick, dark hair. He was close. As he crept along the slope of the hill, he spotted a low cave opening, more of a flat, triangular tunnel than an actual cave. And crouching just inside it, tearing at the raw flesh of some small animal, was the creature he had seen at the stream 2 days before. Deputy Adams raised his rifle. He had the creature dead to rights, trapped inside its own shallow den. But then the creature looked up at him. And Adams froze. Because the eyes looking back at him were not the eyes of an animal. Despite everything, the hair, the rags, the raw meat, the den in the earth, the eyes were unmistakably, undeniably human. The creature held his gaze. It dropped what it had been eating. And it did not try to flee. Instead, it began to shake its head slowly, back and forth, and in a voice that sounded like it had only the faintest grasp of language, it said one word. No. Deputy Adams said he thought his knees might give out from under him. He stood there, staring, and slowly the understanding assembled itself inside him. The thing crouching in that cave was not a monster. It was a man. A young man. A man with a profound and terrible affliction, a medical condition that had caused hair to grow densely across his entire body, distorting his appearance so dramatically that no one who had ever seen him could separate what they saw from what they feared. Adams had been carrying some food with him, hard cheese and a bit of bacon wrapped in a cloth, the kind of thing you pack when you know you'll be out all day. He unwrapped it and held it out. The young man grabbed it and ate ravenously the moment it was offered. And then, over the next several hours, Deputy Adams sat near that cave and began, patiently, to earn the young man's trust. Piece by piece, the story came together. It wasn't entirely clear how it had all unfolded over the years, but the picture that emerged was one of heartbreaking simplicity. The young man had been abandoned as a child, whether by family or by circumstance, Adams couldn't be certain. He had spent what should have been his formative years in a small community somewhere in Montgomery County. But every time people saw him, they were frightened. And when people were frightened, they were violent. He had learned, through years of painful repetition, that the safest thing he could do when he encountered another human being was to run. And so he had been running, and hiding, and surviving alone in the woods, for what appeared to be the better part of his life. Even now, with Adams sitting calmly just a few feet away, the young man would flinch at a sudden movement or a raised voice. His trust had been given carefully, reluctantly, the way you extend your hand to a dog that has been kicked too many times. That night, Adams built a small campfire near the cave entrance. It seemed to be the first time the young man had seen fire up close in a very long time, possibly ever. He wasn't afraid of it, but he watched the way it moved with the open, absorbed fascination of someone encountering something miraculous. And it was by the light of that fire, over many patient hours of gestures and simple words, that Adams finally convinced the young man to come back to town with him in the morning. Not just to begin finding his way back to some version of human life, but to prove something important, that he could not possibly have been the one who attacked Emily Bandy. Because whatever this young man was, a predator who would harm a child was not it. But while Deputy Adams was making that slow, careful, important progress in the woods, something entirely different was unfolding back in a small Montgomery County community called Sims. That afternoon, a homemaker named Carol McCormick was putting away laundry. Specifically, she was tucking her husband Robert's socks back into his drawer, when her hand found something that stopped her completely. A small silver heart necklace, tucked into the back corner of the drawer. And engraved on it, in small and careful letters, was a name. May. Carol stood there for a long moment. Prohibition had ended just 2 years before, which meant her husband Robert now had the perfectly legal freedom to spend his evenings drinking with his friends. He wouldn't be home until well after dark. Which meant Carol had hours, long, quiet, thinking hours, to sit with what she'd found before she could ask him about it. The conclusion she reached was the obvious one. Her husband was having an affair. It made terrible sense. He hadn't been affectionate with her in months. He was always heading out at strange hours for things he didn't particularly want to talk about. He'd even been forgetting to pick up her crocheting supplies from the general store, which was not like him. And now here was a heart-shaped necklace engraved with another woman's name hidden in his sock drawer. By the time Robert staggered through the front door sometime around 10 that night, smelling of whiskey and cigarette smoke, Carol was ready for him. She demanded to know who this May was. He had no answer. He stood in his own kitchen, caught completely off guard, unable to form a coherent response. And Carol took that silence as all the confirmation she needed. Except, and this is the part that makes the whole story lurch sideways, he wasn't guilty of what she thought he was. Because as Carol stood there, shaking with anger and heartbreak, something clicked into place in her mind. She remembered a detail about the attack on Emily Bandy that had been talked about throughout Montgomery County, how Emily's clothing, though torn and scattered around the scene, had been mostly accounted for. All of it except one thing. A necklace. A small silver heart necklace that had belonged to Emily's older sister, a gift, originally, before it was passed on to Emily. And Emily's older sister's name was Mabel Juliet Bandy. More commonly known, to everyone in the county who knew her, as May. Carol went cold from her head to her feet. She turned and looked at her husband. And the look in his eyes, the guilt, the panic, confirmed everything. She ran. She burst through the front door and into the night, screaming as she went. But Robert couldn't let her reach anyone. He couldn't have her telling people what she knew and dismantling the life he'd built on his supposed good name. So he followed her out into the dark, and he swung at her with a shovel. Her screams were what saved her life. A neighbor came out of his house with a shotgun, took in the scene in a single glance, and told Robert McCormick that if he moved so much as an inch, he would blow his head clean off. Robert stopped. The neighbor's wife came out behind him, grabbed a rope from somewhere nearby, and used it to tie Robert up on the spot. And then the neighbor went for the sheriff. Uncle Joe said Bob McCormick spent that night in the county jail, 2 counts of attempted murder, among other charges. The following morning, a still fragile Emily Bandy was brought to his cell. They asked her if that was the man who attacked her. She didn't answer with words. She erupted, screaming, sobbing, stumbling backward into her father's arms, and that was all the answer anyone needed. And then, by what can only be called the purest coincidence, right around the time Emily was being led away from the jailhouse, Deputy Adams walked back into Mount Ida from the opposite direction, and following a cautious distance behind him, wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the noise and the open air and the people, was the young man from the cave. Adams had told him not to be scared. He had promised him that any strange or frightened reaction from the townspeople would be brief, and that a clear explanation would follow. The young man was not a monster. He was a human being with a condition he had not chosen and could not change. He had been neglected. He had been made to fear the very people who should have helped him. And it was past time to begin making that right. While Bob McCormick waited in his cell for trial, the young man stayed with Deputy Adams and his family. Adams's wife took it upon herself to teach him the things he had never learned: how to wash, how to dress himself, how to sit at a table and use a knife and fork without panic. It wasn't quick. It wasn't neat. But it was real, and it was steady. And as he slowly began to find language again, the young man chose a name for himself. He chose Joseph. He chose it, he said, after sitting through Mrs. Adams's Bible study sessions and learning to read. The story of Joseph in the scriptures had reached him in a way that little else had. Joseph was a man abandoned by those who were supposed to love him most, sold and imprisoned in a land that was not his own. And yet Joseph forgave them. He told his brothers, in Genesis 50 verse 20, that what they had meant for evil, God had turned toward good. That even betrayal could be the first step on the road to something extraordinary. By the time Bob McCormick was sentenced to 50 years of hard labor, Deputy Adams was working on finding young Joseph a job. Given his profound anxiety around strangers and his complete lack of formal education, regular employment was simply not realistic. But Adams refused to give up on him. And when he heard that a traveling carnival and freak show was passing through Montgomery County, he went to have a look. What he found was nothing like what he had expected. Instead of a cruel operation that exploited vulnerable people for profit, he found something closer to a sanctuary. There was a bearded lady named Leela, a tiny dwarf man who danced the Lindy Hop with more energy than most men twice his size, and a fellow who called himself the Lizard Man but who was, in reality, simply a man with an unusual skin condition. These people welcomed Joseph without hesitation. They told him he had finally found a place where nobody would stare or run or reach for something to throw. And since Joseph had been born and raised just down the road from Story, Arkansas, his stage name essentially chose itself. Backstage, among his new family, he would always be Joseph. But to the paying audience, he would be the Wolf Man, something strange and wonderful and impossible, someone people would hand over good money just to see and speak to. And for the first time in his life, what had always been used against him became something that gave him a place in the world. Uncle Joe told us that Deputy Adams reportedly cried the day the carnival left town, not from sadness, but because of the way Joseph had thanked him. Whatever words passed between them that morning, they were apparently the kind that stay with a person for the rest of their life. And that was how the story of Emily Bandy, Deputy Adams, and the Wolf Man of Story, Arkansas passed into local legend, told from one generation to the next around tables and firesides and Thanksgiving gatherings, exactly like the one where my cousin and I first heard it. Now, I want to be clear about something. My cousin and I did not simply take Uncle Joe's word for any of this. We went and looked. We were absolutely certain there was no town in Arkansas called Story and no body of water in this world with the name Murder Creek. We were wrong on both counts. Every single place Uncle Joe mentioned, checked out. And to me, that's all I needed. Because sometimes the most extraordinary truth is hiding in plain sight, right there in the places the maps have always shown, waiting for someone to finally look. What did you think of that story? Has an older family member ever shared something with you that turned out to be completely, verifiably true, something that shook your understanding of what the world is capable of? Tell me about it in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story from us. My name is Katarina. I recently became a subscriber, and I believe I have a story from my younger years that some of you might find worth hearing. I live now in London, with my husband and my grown daughter. But I grew up in Russia during the Soviet era. And in the summer of 1984, I was 26 years old and working as a junior researcher at the Leningrad Institute of Geology. My work was, to put it in the simplest possible terms, boring. Geology is a fascinating field in the abstract, but junior researchers spend the vast majority of their time doing repetitive and unglamorous work, cataloging samples, running analyses, writing reports that no one above you will read for months. The one significant perk of working at a university in the Soviet system, however, was the possibility of travel. And so when I was offered a spot on a research expedition to Siberia, I said yes before anyone could change their mind. There were 8 of us in total, a mixed team of researchers. We flew from Moscow to Omsk, then onward to Krasnoyarsk, and from there, a much smaller plane was waiting to take us the rest of the way, to a town called Zotino, on the banks of the Yenisei River, where we were to study nearby coal deposits. The plane was an old Antonov, one of the small, propeller-driven kind that smelled permanently of engine oil and offered essentially no comfort to the people sitting inside it. We were on metal benches, sample bags balanced across our laps, having to shout at each other just to be heard over the constant rattling and vibration. It was miserable, but it was an adventure. We were all young and more or less happy to be miserable together. Then, about 2 hours into the flight, the engines began to cough. First one, then the other. The pilot came on the intercom. He said it was nothing to worry about. His voice was calm and professional. And then, approximately 60 seconds later, the plane dropped hard, a sudden, lurching fall that had everyone screaming before they could even process what was happening. I grabbed the metal bench and held on with everything I had. The edge cut into my fingers. The sound of rushing air outside the fuselage grew and grew, becoming something close to a scream itself. Tree branches appeared in the windows, green and rushing and terrifyingly close, and then there was an impact that threw all of us forward at once, and the sound of metal twisting and glass breaking, and then nothing. I woke up inside the wreck. There was a stillness in the air that felt wrong, too complete, too heavy. My head was pounding and my knee was screaming with pain, but I could stand. The pilot and co-pilot were still in their seats. They had not made it. Of the 8 researchers, the rest of us were alive, but in serious trouble. Yuri had a broken leg. Tanya's arm was broken so badly that she couldn't stop crying. The others had various combinations of broken bones, twisted joints, cuts, bruises, and cracked ribs. The radio was destroyed. There would be no calling for help. Most of my colleagues couldn't walk. I was the only one on my feet. The logic of the situation was very clear, even if it wasn't particularly welcome, I was going to have to go and find help myself. We took stock of what had survived the crash. 2 plastic water bottles from the cockpit. 3 small bags of peanuts that the flight attendant had distributed before takeoff. Not much, but enough to keep everyone going for a while, carefully rationed. There was also a flare gun, though flares are only really effective once the sky has darkened, and we had hours yet before sunset. Every minute of daylight was precious. I tucked the water and the peanuts into my coat pockets, listened to my colleagues wish me luck, and I walked into the forest. The first day was the most manageable. I found what appeared to be a game trail and followed it east, or what I believed was east. The mosquitoes were relentless, attacking my face and neck in dense, maddening clouds. By evening, my knee was throbbing steadily, and I had already drunk more than half of one of the water bottles. I found a place to shelter, ate a small handful of peanuts, and slept against a fallen log until the cold woke me up in the small hours of the morning. On the second day, the wolves found me. I heard them before I saw them. Their howls started far off and then crept closer with every passing hour. Eventually I spotted them moving between the trees, gray shapes, thin and purposeful, at least 6 or 7 of them. They weren't rushing. They weren't attacking. They were simply following, keeping a distance of 20 or 30 meters, watching with a patience that was more frightening than any charge would have been. I picked up a heavy branch and made myself as large and as loud as possible, shouting, waving my arms, doing everything I knew to signal that I was not something to be tested. They pulled back slightly. But they did not leave. That night, I built a small fire with dry pine needles and twigs. I sat with my back to the flames and watched the darkness in front of me. Before long, I could see the firelight reflected in the wolves' eyes, a ring of small glowing points, perfectly still, watching and waiting. I took a burning branch from the fire and waved it at them, shouting until my throat ached. They shifted slightly. They still didn't leave. By the third day, the water was almost entirely gone. One bag of peanuts remained. My lips were cracking from dehydration, and every single step I took sent a fresh jolt of pain up through my knee and into my hip. The forest was the same in every direction, tall pines, fallen logs, more pines, as far as any horizon I could find. I began talking to myself. Not because I had lost my composure, but because hearing a human voice, even my own, helped me keep moving. I told myself that my comrades back at the wreck were still alive. I told myself I was going to find someone. I told myself to keep walking. The wolves were closer now. I could feel them tightening the distance as I slowed. I kept the branch in my hand like a weapon, but I was under no illusion. If they decided to come for me, a branch would not save me. Late in the afternoon of the fourth day, I smelled wood smoke. My first thought was that I was hallucinating, that exhaustion and dehydration had finally started to manufacture things. But then I heard the sound of large saws. And then I started walking faster, and then I was nearly running, stumbling through the undergrowth toward that sound with my heart hammering so hard that it hurt. The trees thinned. And there, stretched out in front of me, was a small logging camp. 5 or 6 wooden huts, a generator chugging away and issuing a thin column of black smoke, a large stack of cut timber, and men in padded jackets and felt boots moving between the buildings. They weren't Russian. They were Chinese migrant workers, employed through an international labor program. I had heard rumors that such arrangements existed, that contract workers from China came to the Soviet Far East to cut timber, but I had never actually encountered any of them. One of the men spotted me as I approached and called out, and they all stopped what they were doing and turned to look. A short man in a black cap came forward. He spoke Russian with a heavy accent, but I could understand him clearly. He asked where I had come from and what had happened to me. I told him everything. Plane crash. Injured colleagues. Wolves. 4 days of walking through the forest. He didn't waste a moment on unnecessary questions. He simply brought me inside the nearest hut, sat me down, and within minutes someone had put a cup of hot, sweet tea in my hands. They fed me rice and salted fish. And as the warmth spread through me and the reality of what I'd been through finally caught up with me all at once, I began to cry, not for myself, but for the people I had left back at the wreck, and for the fear that I'd been carrying silently for 4 days without allowing myself to feel it. The man in the black cap was named Lao. He sat across from me and spoke to me gently until I had collected myself. Then he picked up the phone mounted to the wall of the hut, spoke rapidly in Chinese, waited, and then switched to Russian. He read coordinates off a map, gave a brief but thorough account of the situation, and then put the phone down and told me help was on its way. The rescue team arrived the following morning in 2 helicopters. I told them the rough direction I had walked from, and they flew us west over that immense and endless sea of trees, a landscape so vast and so uniform that finding anything within it seemed genuinely impossible. And then someone pointed. And there it was, almost invisible from the air, a crumpled metallic shape in the green, a small scar in the canopy. My comrades were still alive. They had stretched a tarpaulin over the crash plane's wing and huddled beneath it through 4 days and nights, keeping each other as warm and as calm as they could manage. When they heard the helicopters, those of them who could move at all hobbled out into the open and began to wave. There was no place to land, so the rescue workers lowered stretchers on ropes and hauled my injured colleagues up one by one. I was in the helicopter with Yuri and Tanya. They were too weak and too exhausted to say much. But there were no words adequate to what we felt in that moment, sitting together in the noise and vibration of that helicopter, watching the forest fall away beneath us. No words at all. They took us to a hospital some distance away. Bones were set, medications were administered, and for the first time in nearly a week, we slept in actual beds and ate actual food. After a week of treatment and rest, we were put on a plane back to Leningrad. We expected to be welcomed back. We had survived a plane crash in one of the most remote regions on Earth. We had lost our pilot and co-pilot. We had endured days of injury and exposure and gone without proper food or water. We thought, perhaps naively, that this would be acknowledged. Instead, our colleagues from the Institute met us at the airport with nervous faces and eyes that couldn't quite meet ours. And when we got back to the building and sat down, they delivered the news. Because of our failure to complete the research assignment, the ministry had decided to cut the department's funding. That was how things worked. It didn't matter that none of what happened had been within our control. It didn't matter that we had done everything possible to survive and to rescue one another. Someone had to be responsible, and we were the most convenient candidates. Quite literally adding insult to the very considerable injuries we had already sustained. I was back at work within 6 weeks. For a long time afterward, my knee would ache whenever it rained, a reliable, unwanted reminder of the forest floor and the 4 days I spent crossing it. And some nights I would wake up from dreams I would rather not describe, with the memory of those glowing eyes still fresh in the dark. I still have one of the empty peanut bags. It's faded and torn now, and the printing on it has almost disappeared entirely. But I keep it in a drawer at home. Because it reminds me, on the days when I need reminding, of what I have lived through and what I have been capable of. We survived not only because I could walk when others couldn't, but because strangers in the middle of Siberia didn't ask unnecessary questions before deciding to help. Because sometimes, in the most unlikely places, human kindness shows up exactly when you need it most. And because sometimes, just sometimes, the world gives you a chance you very nearly didn't get. And if you're still listening right now, I hope that wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, you feel even the smallest echo of that same truth, that resilience is real, that kindness matters, and that sometimes surviving is the most extraordinary thing a person can do. What did Katerina's story stir in you? Have you ever found yourself pushed far beyond what you believed your limits were, and discovered something on the other side of that line? Share your thoughts in the comments. It means so much to hear from you. And if you've been here with us for this whole journey tonight, thank you. Truly. Please like this video if these stories moved you, share it with someone in your life who loves stories of real courage and real people, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're always the first to know when we share something new. We'll see you in the next one.